morning, everyone. My name is Damon Williams. I am Vice Provost and Chief Diversity Officer, and welcome to this year's Diversity Forum. We're incredibly excited and enthused about your presence here, about our speakers, about our breakouts and our poster sessions. This has been the most well-responded to forum since the forum's creation roughly 13 years ago. We still have some open spaces in the room right now because I anticipate that folks will be flowing in and flowing out through the day. But we do have registered over 550 individuals for today's forum, and we do have nearly 300 students at least that we're anticipating for this afternoon's keynote, which will feature Professor of Law at Harvard University, Lonnie Guinier. This morning's session, we will have remarks from Chancellor Ward, and I believe that those remarks are so appropriate given the theming that we took for today, which is embracing our past to chart our future. Last night, we launched the forum with a student leadership event. We had nearly 300 students, primarily first years, who were right here in this room last night, and they had a panel discussion that happened. And we had invited back several of our illustrious alumni who were able to share their perspective of leadership. And we did that event because it launches a new initiative out of my office, which is to become even more intentional and laser-like focused around this idea of intentional leadership development. In the economy and the world we live in today, where over 50% of college graduates are underemployed and unemployed, I think it is essential that we do everything we can to double down on leadership. And so that event, where 300 students participated, launched this new initiative and focus on intentional leadership development out of my office. Today's remarks from Chancellor Ward will be followed by some question and answer. We do have microphones to the left and to the right. It is my pleasure to welcome to the stage two of our wonderful student leaders, Mia Akers and Britt Mose, who are the chair and the vice chair of the ASM Diversity Committee. Mia and Britt.
Good morning. First, we'd like to thank Dr. Williams for giving us this wonderful opportunity to introduce Chancellor Ward. Chancellor Ward was born in Manchester, New England, and he came from the United States as an international student, winning a Fulbright Travel Award in 1960. Having earned his BA and MA at the University of Leeds in the United Kingdom, he enrolled at UW-Madison as a graduate student. In 3 years, by 1963, he earned a doctorate in urban geography and went off to teach at the University of British Columbia in Canada. But fortunately for the university, he returned to UW-Madison in 1966 as a professor of urban geography.
David Ward's UW-Madison faculty career spans more than 30 years, and he holds the Andrew Hill Clark Professorship of Geography. From 1974 to 1977, he served as chair of the Geography Department. From 1980 to 1987, he was Associate Dean of the Graduate School. In 1989, he was appointed Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs at UW-Madison. In 1991, he was also named Provost as Chief Deputy to the Chancellor, at that time Chancellor Donna Shalala. In January 1993, he took on the position of Interim Chancellor. And in June 1993, he was then named Chancellor, becoming the 25th University Chief Executive.
During his tenure, Chancellor Ward provided strong leadership in setting diversity as a university priority. Working with Chancellor Donna Shalala, Vice Chancellor Ward was key to the successful implementation of the groundbreaking Madison Plan and its Faculty of Color Hiring Initiative. As Chancellor in 1993, he strongly reinstated the university's diversity goals in the Madison Commitment.
Then in 1998, Chancellor Ward led the university in creating the university's second 10-year plan 2008 by building on our previous diversity programs to move forward our current campus vision priorities and plans for the recruitment and retention of students of color, successful initiatives to increase student financial aid, a leadership institute to prepare future leaders, and a strategic hiring plan for new faculty. After stepping down as chancellor, Chancellor Ward was invited to serve as president of the American Council on Education in Washington, D.C., the largest and most prestigious higher education association, with a membership of over 1,800 colleges, universities, and education organizations. He served as president of the ACE from 2008 to 2011.
We are indeed fortunate that when we needed a strong and proven leader, we have Chancellor Ward to turn to and have him serve UW-Madison as interim chancellor, or as some students refer to him as, Chancellor Encore. Not just one time,
But for a second time.
I sometimes don't know whether that's me. Suppose it might be, but I'm delighted to be here, and I do love the idea that it was a bunch of Chancellor scholars who, when they saw that I was interim chancellor, thought it was odd since I'd already been chancellor in my own right. What's this word interim mean? I said, well, you know, it's kind of ugly, but it's okay. So they said, well, we'll find a nicer word, and that's where the term Chancellor Encore came. It sounds sweeter, doesn't it? I am, of course, now a lame duck, too, to use the metaphor. There is a search committee that will work very diligently for the next 6 months, and I think the hope is that as of the Board of Regents meeting next April, there'll be an announcement of a new chancellor. So usually the term lame duck is used for those who now know there is an inevitable turnover. But I want to tell you, I still fly very well. The opportunity, I think, that Damon mentioned here is to perhaps have a long view as well as a short view. I think meetings like this have an imperative to think about how we organize ourselves and focus ourselves in the immediate future. But I also think it's an opportunity to remember that there is a tradition, there are a set of commitments that have been made in the past. Most of them have never completely fulfilled themselves, but I think the energy that went into them moved us not as far as we would wish, but certainly much further than had we not had a sort of flair, a rhetorical commitment, something which labeled the issue of diversity and equity as a value deeply within the university. So even though, as I look back over 50, 60, or even 100 years and feel, gosh, these are very tough issues to make rapid and significant progress in, to, in a sense, deny that there is some progress would perhaps undermine our confidence in moving into the future with greater commitment. I think you probably heard I'm an old guy, so I arrived here even as a graduate student in 1960, and I was thinking of how impressed I was in that particular year about the American Civil Rights Union, arriving from England, by the way, by boat and by train, not by air, getting off at the Chicago Northwestern station up on West Washington there, walking into the campus and seeing a vibrant civil rights movement on campus. Black, white, and others, very, very committed to, in a way, rights of citizenship, a more abstract, less materialistic commitment to the idea of equality of citizenship, something which obviously one would think would be embedded in the Constitution but was not. So, but the intensity, the commitment, even the issues where students were going out to motels that were still segregated in small towns around Madison, and in a way confronting them with the reality of what they were doing. So there was a movement there in the early 60s, which in a sense then broadened more in the late 60s into an anti-war movement and a different kind of focus developed. But I think there was a moment there in the late 50s and early 60s where there was the origins, if you like, of a holistic, of a commitment by all folks to something which said there needs to be equal rights and a sense of citizenship that is completely holistic and inclusive. So I think back at that period with a great deal of affection. The second, from that period, I forgot that there were certain programs that I think even that have survived even today that go back that far. I think the AAP, the Academic Advancement Program, actually goes back to the 60s, the idea of, in a sense, recognizing underrepresented groups that came from either school systems, households, neighborhoods, where in fact the challenge of entering college would be a problem. And how do you create, in a sense, some form of support structure for students who arrive in a sense, not necessarily intellectually unprepared, but unprepared for a completely different world setting in which they're now trying to cope. I think it's in 2014, the AAP will be, in fact, 50 years old. Might be something that we can think of recognizing. It was one of those early programs that recognized the nature and the complexity of what we might call, in the broadest sense, advising. The second era that I felt was pretty important having energy in the cause of diversity and equity would, I think, be the late 80s, early 90s. I think I have to attribute much of the energy of that to my then boss, Donna Shalala, who arrived on this campus, and I think with the sense that while we had individual focus on issues of diversity, I'd served on several Senate committees devoted to increasing particularly the admission of faculty and staff of color to our teaching programs, and others were very committed to student recruitment. She, in a sense, changed the energy level, the rhetorical energy, and a sort of created more of, I would call, a collective institutional commitment, rather than the idea that certain individuals on campus had a reputation for being committed to this issue. It became institutionalized at that time, whereas before that, we always had faculty and staff and key students at various times with a great commitment. But we recognized individual leadership. The sense of an institutional commitment was much vaguer. And I think we have to attribute to her a sense of understanding that. And she did arrive, actually, at a point when I believe there were difficulties, maybe worse than that, in terms of particularly student intergroup relationships. There was a great deal of stress, a great deal of difficulty, and in fact, out of that came the existence of a black student union, a sense only through some sort of separate commitment to the achievement of African American issues was it possible. I think we were able to work our way out of that issue by, in a sense, addressing institutionally the issue at large. And the Charles Holley, who had been the president of the Black Student Union, in fact chaired a faculty-student committee to try to figure out, first of all, what was it that was such an aggravation to interpersonal and intergroup relations, but also what would we do to try and address them. The report was quite radical. In fact, for many people, way too radical to even imagine that you would read it in order to implement it. The genius, I think, of Donna Shalala was to isolate some 3 or 4 issues in there, focus on those, pull them out and say, let's just focus on these to begin with. And I think that focus was pretty critical, and it created what became the first of a institutionally designed plan to try and address issues of diversity and equity. It was known actually as the Madison Plan. It was remarkable because, in a way, even though we might have been running behind many of our peer institutions in the late 70s and 80s, this rather formal but yet also assertive, well-funded goal to try to change the complexion and, I might say, the institutional culture of this campus was seen as a remarkable reform and actually the running edge of how to deal with issues of diversity on a large, comprehensive, and selective campus. And that was, I became provost just as that, well, actually was then vice chancellor for academic affairs, to see how that went. And I was actually in the engine room. And I think it empowered a lot of people by the fact that there was now a sort of institutional commitment, empowered a lot of people and created a much greater depth and commitment. And I believe the outcomes, particularly although they were modest, the outcomes were, I think, measurable. And 5 years after that plan, I think it was fair to say that while we would have wished we had achieved more, I am convinced that nothing would have been achieved without it. And therefore, one has to sort of look back at that 5-year period as a truly remarkable blip, a kind of cliff that we climbed to a new plateau in terms of the proportions of students, faculty, and staff of color on the campus. So that would be my second sort of sense of looking backwards. As I think about it, it doesn't look like the past to me, but I suppose the years 1989 to 1993 really are part of history now. I'm so, old that somehow or other it seems like yesterday, but for many, I'm sure in this room, it is an era, a particular era in how civil rights broadened themselves and how an institution took ownership of it. Some of the, I've got a few data here. The Madison Plan is, in a sense, might have been defined by the very low levels of participation in students of color, students from underrepresented groups at that time. I think it was less than 5% among our undergraduates. Today, it's just under 15%. Hitting 15%, I think, will be important. Much of that early climb, much of the institutional fabric that has allowed the recruitment to proceed came from that era. In terms of faculty, at that time, I think it was about 6%. Today, it's approaching 18%. So while we might think of these as modest gains, my instinct tells me that if the institution hadn't sort of gathered a kind of collective energy to approach this, I think it would have been very difficult to achieve those goals. The other thing is that we've got to also remember there are eras when the university is growing, in which case there are new faculty and staff to be had. There are other periods when the university has no new resources, like now. There is unlikely in the next 6 years to be lots in aggregate of new faculty. All the gains will come from turnover, from retirement and so on. And so the challenge of these numerical commitments do vary from time to time. It was fortunate that I think in the early 90s there was a surge of growth of the institution which gave us an opportunity, not a high retirement rate, but a surge of growth in the number of faculty and staff. The second one of these was the Madison Initiative. I now became chancellor in my own right. How could we keep the energy of the Madison Plan going? And that was the Madison Initiative, which was, I think, more an effort to take the role down to departments and colleges and schools, to try to hold accountable, if you like, the middle of the institution, rather than, in a sense, there were a lot of campus-wide nude money that could be given to departments. Very little reallocation. The Madison Initiative was saying, look, this needs to be done as a matter of normal activity. This cannot just rely on new resources. You have to say, with the resources you have now, that if there is a retirement, there's a new position, this issue of diversity and equity should matter for that position too. You can't just expect new resources to allow this to happen. So the Madison Initiative, in some way, was trying to take the decision-making down to the level where, in fact, the search committees worked, not something that there was a sort of nice, generous banker in the chancellor's office who would always do this if you found the right person. This was saying we need to integrate this into the normal process of adding new folks. In terms of students, I think the key breakthrough, if there wants to call it breakthrough, was the concept of group recruitment. It seems to me that one of the challenges we faced in the late 80s and early 90s was we still waited around for students to apply. Though, obviously, we are never short of student applicants. Even today, this is the case. And we tended to view students as individuals. Even though, if you look at some of the precocious students, they frequently came in groups of 5 to 10 from certain high schools. And when they arrived here, they brought that human resource of group consciousness from being at the same high school with them. Why shouldn't that also be something that would be a means of recruiting non-majority students? And I think there was the development of programs, many of which I think have really succeeded, which reach out to the schools, recognize that intervening even before high school, during high school, and encouraging a sense of group support amongst those who join us, hoping that 5, 6, or 7 students from the same environs would be admitted and would therefore bring a human resource structure of their relationships to them when they arrive in Madison. I think it was also a period where the role of particularly undergraduate advising was taken much more seriously. It would be fair to say that in the 70s and 80s, there might have been a Darwinian view of surviving as an undergraduate. There used to be a statement even earlier than the 70s, which as a freshman at UW-Madison, if you were in a line of freshmen, in 1963 you turned to the right and you turned to the left. As a senior, if you did that, they were both gone. In other words, our completion rates and our continuity of the lack of dropout was like many of our state universities in that time, was not the greatest. Today, we're far better at eliminating the issues of dropout far better at time to degree. Can you read the time to degree? We're still being beaten up by state legislators on the 4 to 5 year degree, and yet it's just a consistent upward course in time to degree. Far better than when those legislators ever went to college, and many of them would never have gone through in 4 years anyway. So, you know, this issue of... But I think advising is the key, and this is one of the favorable outcomes of a focus on students that needed advising, and what we realized then is all students needed it. It was the improvement in advising for all students began because we recognized there were special needs that might have been needed for a particular set of students, but now we recognize all students need effective, constructive advising. This is a great outcome for everybody out of what started as a specific initiative within the Madison Initiative. So there's a case where I think the rapid growth of effective advising, nationwide I might add, came out of a recognition that over and above and beyond just participating in a curriculum, there needs to be this more individualized, more customized engagement with students. And of course, that's one of the things that is often thought of as a cost factor in higher education. And do you know where all the journalists put this particular rich cultural, educational experience of advising? It is classified as administration. And so when you see these stories about the increase in the cost of administration and why that's a factor in the cost that higher education costs, do we really want advising to be counted as administration? It's unambiguously teaching and learning. And therefore, if it should be counted in the curriculum, there's nothing exceptional or undesirable about advising being integrated into what we do as we deliver the curriculum. Some of the data, therefore, that we deal with, this is my ACE presidential hat speaking, where I had to deal with the Congress about the rise of administrative costs. And when you break it down, I discovered that in this category was a significant amount of advising. And I said, hey, this is kind of silly, isn't it? And nevertheless, the way data is collected, once it's collected one way, changing it in the bowels of the government is very difficult. The similar point, by the way, about dropouts. Found this out when I was ACE. Dropouts, actually, 90% drop back in. Why do we use the term dropout for transfer students? If you leave an institution, you're a dropout. But if you transfer and get your degree somewhere else, the national data doesn't count that. We only count degrees that are given at the institution you enter. Now we do know that nationwide large numbers of students transfer. So now we kill ourselves with other countries where there's virtually no tradition of transfer, where most students in European and Japan, China, go 4 years in one institution, very little transfer. Transfer is the genius of our system. And here we are, we don't count our success. We say, these kids drop out. So, well, what happens if they drop in and get a degree somewhere else? So I'm in the drop-in business. So that really brings me to my third era, which was at ACE, which is trying to understand national initiatives with respect to student achievement. But within that, I think we were frequently worried about the, quote, underperformance of students who came from underrepresented groups. And I think that that began for us to qualify these issues, not just in terms of identity politics and, in a sense, cultural conflict, but also more materialistic issues of poverty, poor schools. In other words, the environmental setting of identity became a much bigger issue for us at ACE, and that's where the issue of transfer, the issue of individuals who were in the military service, came out of military service, was there a GI plan for them, just like there was for many people in World War II. So we began, in a sense, to broaden the commitment by recognizing that this was not just a problem of an individual. Just as we opened up to group recruitment, we now started to understand better the setting in which individuals come from before arriving in college. And I think that may be the early 21st century issue, how to, in a sense, meld a sense of identity, of cultural identity, which itself creates certain challenges, but over and above and beyond that, having, in a sense, disadvantaged origins, which may affect a very broad range of people, but is still a challenge in terms of fairness in higher education. And how to bring together, if you like, a diversity issue, and then equity, which in some senses is a more universal issue. One could come from a very poor, impoverished, poor white home, and there are both cultural and deprivation issues there. And I think there's a lot of very effective dialogue going on now about what I call the context of diversity, the context and challenge that is broadening it and makes it, in some respects, a broader social movement than a more narrow focus on identity politics, which I think certainly drove the Madison Plan in the late 1980s. The other issue, which I don't know quite how to interpret, but in some parts of the country, I was recently at UC San Diego, Southern California, identity politics is becoming unpacked by intermarriage. It's a very challenging. I mean, what identity do you choose? You could choose two, whatever, and how to recognize the implications of that. The census of 2010 had some of the same issues. People are not declaring, if you like, their sense of color because they are from more than one kind of color. Perhaps the president himself is a symbol of how to cope with this kind of issue. But I do think that area, there is a context, there's a changing context. And as I look back to the 60s, I look back to the early 90s, and now look back to the dialogues we're going on, I say this not because I have any answers. I'm saying it just that it's creating a setting in which the debate to increase representation of specific groups is changing. It's not the same. The elevator's at a different floor. It's as if you press the elevator, and as we move up that elevator, the context as we look out of those elevator doors is different than when we're on the ground floor. So I've tried, in a sense, to take Damon's idea of try to reflect. It's a little bit of a personal narrative, but I'm a very minor player in it. I think these are genuine cultural, historical settings within which a commitment to diversity has occurred. And the real question is, this third complex is struggling a little bit. We all know what we went through last year with respect to holistic admissions. We really do believe in holistic admissions and how that is contested because people want to go back to the idea that this is simply an ordinal ranking of individuals, as if a university freshman class has no social creativity engaged in how one creates that class. The idea of just count down the list, knowing full well that the tests that drive the ordinal ranking have perhaps a 51% probability of success over some other measure. So I do think we're in a different age, and I think the idea of group recruitment is something we've gained, advising is something we've gained, but how we now deal with what we call holistic admissions, providing a coherent, sensible, and forceful defense of that is really where we are. It is being attacked. Even today in Texas, you will recognize there are things going on in the law. The Texas case going to the Supreme Court is really undermining our collective efforts to create what might be better said to be at least approaching a microcosm of our society rather than being something that looks completely unrelated to the society around us. Universities will never survive unless there's at least some sense of conformity between the outside and the inside. And that's what holistic admissions is really all about. Defending this is difficult because there is a profound sense in American culture of individualistic rationality, and that in the end is the bottom line of what we're about. And how one balances this strong value with the idea that there are some collective values, some public values, some sense of an institutional coherence that is not there just because of the sum of individual divisions. That's harder in this political era to keep conveying that idea. So I think I've tried to say a little bit about the past and about the present, how the present presents some real issues to us. I suspect that there is something that could come out of this diversity forum is how, in a sense, to bring together this new context, take old commitments, bring them together so that we can say to each other, we're in the next 5 years going to do X, Y, and Z. I think this kind of energy is the kind of energy that allows you to take yourself up to the next floor. So I think I've tried to give you a sense of my student experience, my experience as chancellor the first time, some of my experiences at ACE. I really do think the numbers who have turned up today give me pause to think that there's a chance of a real rich dialogue that encompasses a significant piece or segment of this university community. So I would just now encourage you to move forward, dialogue, and think about how, on a 5-year scale, can we, in a sense, build on the past, but perhaps create a future that will have a different context, perhaps some different details about how we go about doing it. But on the other hand, remember, there are some practices, some best practices that really do carry forward from this rich past, which, though it may never have been successful to those of us who had even higher goals for our outcomes, nevertheless, they have set the course which we really need to follow. So I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted we have this kind of turnout. I want to thank Damon and all of his staff for bringing together the sense of dialogue. And I wish you just a very creative dialogue with perhaps some very, very deliberative outcomes that can allow this institution to keep the history of being committed to civil rights, being committed to cultural pluralism, and now being committed to the sense of equity, which is even bigger than either of those two ideas. Thanks very much. I have a hot mic. What Damon wants to do is, if anybody would like to ask a question, maybe you can shout, or maybe this microphone works better.
That microphone definitely works.
Oh, now you're working. We can hear you, Damon.
Okay. Yes, I invite anyone to come to either this microphone or that microphone if they'd like to ask a question to Chancellor Ward. He's been gracious enough to take a couple questions before he has to move to another meeting. Questions?
Want to come? You can come up here and ask us, right?
Hi.
This is fine. This is
Okay, all right. So the question I have is, so much of the tracking of diversity relates with numbers. Is there anything being done to track the numbers of queer or trans identified people who are in the faculty, in the staff, in the student population? Yeah.
You know, I'm not an expert on this, but I believe there is some. And if there's somebody other than I who knows whether we're doing it precisely or not, is there anybody here who knows? Because I think it's a question I can't answer. I would wish that we are, so that we know the scale and size of the problem, but I'm not sure I can give a straight answer.
Hi. And we don't, and there isn't a national trend or local and regional trend or among our other Big Ten institutions where we have a mechanism to track either the numbers or experiences of LGBTQ students on campus. So that's the simplest answer.
Not really, but I think you'll be good at it.
Well, first of all, I want to let you know that I love all the BBC show, and I have to wait a year to catch up with them, so if you have any special access, please let me know. My question is in relation to the campus campaign on innovation. And as you may know, innovation is socially constructed. So some ideas that are innovated related to equity and diversity are not often labeled innovation. For example, affirmative action or civil rights movement. And innovation often are related to things that produce more money or scientific idea. Example would be when the European arrived here and removed the Native American, they probably thought they were being innovative. So my question is this, is while we are championing this idea of innovation all over in the school and colleges, I don't hear how equity and diversity are being included in that conversation. So sometimes programs are being generated, so now to be revenue generated, and in turn exclude certain people access to program. So I just want to hear your comment on that. Thank you.
This is a great question. Actually, it came up yesterday when we reopened the remodeled Old Red Gym. It really relates to the fact that we've tried to tie in the Wisconsin idea with innovation and try to have a concept that innovation in relation to Wisconsin idea has always been both economic and social. There's always been a kind of parallel development. But in honor of the reopening of the Old Red Gym and the Year of Innovation, we tried to bring the two together there, and I spoke about it yesterday afternoon, is a new scholarship for undergraduates in the tradition of the Wisconsin undergraduate scholarships, which will focus on social innovation, particularly in how to help, if you like, groups that may be poorly funded. It may be unclear where money can come from. It may be how to partner underfunded with potential donors who, instead of, in a sense, being motivated only by surplus or profit, may, in fact, see social stability as something they want to connect with. So I think the Year of Innovation, as I see it, there is almost inevitably a first assumption about entrepreneurship, economic development, startup companies, and of course, in this world, that's celebrated. And there's no question that that's created some energy, and in the symbol of the Wisconsin Institutes of Discovery. But I think if you look carefully at the plans and the three objectives of the Year of Innovation, one of them is unambiguously committed to social innovation, and the other two may have something like that. So I think your question is dead on, because the rhetorical idea of innovation is narrowly conceived, and therefore can lead people to believe, well, they only care about creating, in a sense, self-funded operations. But I think it's bigger than that. I would say, though, that running an institution, the contrast between when I was here last time and now is the issue of resources. I could always find resources to reallocate in the 90s. My biggest problem right now is that when something goes wrong, there is no reserve fund anywhere. I mean, it really is a very different, almost deathly world of fiscal structure within the university. There's very little scope to do things. And of course, most of what we do that's creative is actually through reallocation. And you have to hope that the place that the money comes from is not likely to be happy. But it is a world, unfortunately, of priorities. What I think we have to do is not try and imagine that resources don't matter, or doing things that cannot possibly produce any economic resource. I think if they have social retention, that too should be a factor in how we look at it. But I think this question is terrific because it raises a question about the context of the word innovation. And I think it is too narrowly conceived, but I do want to assure you that our concept, Dean Underwood and Dean Francois Ortella-Magna, we've really tried to see if we can look at groups and we can look at what one might call social purpose, which may have long-term resource implications. But what a great question, and I admire your passion for relating us to that so that we don't, in effect, allow a narrowly considered view of innovation to define what we're about. A great question. I really appreciate it. Maybe one more, and then Okay. Challenge of a Chancellor is narrative of the morning, means that you move to several places. I'm glad I'm a geographer because I understand place and movement. But this is a moment for you to take charge now. I appreciate you listening. I appreciate the questions. Good luck with the day.